All right, welcome to week 4 of Intro to Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. My name is Itzel, and today I'm going to be providing a brief um, just discussion about where we are in the class, where you should be at in terms of week 4, grades, and all of that. And I'm gonna jump in right into the lecture and get started on the themes, the readings, and the PowerPoint slides that are also available on Canvas. So by now, everybody should have updated grades for their last 3 weekly response posts. Make sure that you're paying attention to the comment section of your grades, where I'm writing in a few notes for you on what you did well, what you can improve on, just basically providing feedback on your response post. And just a quick note on the grade, the total grade is out of 10 points. Nobody in the class will ever really receive anything lower than 5 points minimum, because I don't really believe in providing a zero. I would just rather give you the opportunity to redo it. But this is something that we have to have discussed in advance. Or you can reach out to me about it if you're concerned about one of your grades. But for the most part, everybody did a really good job. And I wanted to say that one thing I noticed across everybody's work is many of you are summarizing extensively. And while this is okay for now, because we're just starting this off and you're developing new writing skills, um, I want you to work on summarizing less of the readings and focusing more on your own analysis, building your own arguments. And what I mean by this is, for example, many of you did this well when you compared 2 different authors or readings and discussed how they were in conversation to each other while answering some of the guided questions that I propose each week. And a lot of you have had emails like, do I answer the questions? Do I answer the readings? What am I supposed to be focusing on? And really, it's a combination of both, because the guided questions are getting at the main themes, the stakes, the methods. That's what those questions are there for. And the purpose of why I do this is so that you develop skills in learning how to identify an argument, or what's called a thesis statement, the methods, the stakes. And I've outlined all of this in this worksheet here that's available to everybody. But the thesis is the main argument, and this is important because a lot of authors don't always state this explicitly, or sometimes it's intertwined with the stakes and the methods. So you want to tease out all of this information, because this will help you learn how to build your own arguments when you're writing out your responses. So the thesis, I'm sure you're aware, is the main focus point, the main argument. A lot of times when you're writing a statement like this yourself, you can explicitly say, I will argue, or this analysis between belt and hooks suggests that, or I found the purpose of Crenshaw's intersectionality theory was blah blah blah. So this is what I want you to start practicing in your responses. The summary is great, and while that's a skill that is also important, I really want you to get at building your own analysis and presenting that in your responses each week. So please focus on the commentary that I provided. So the stakes are why the argument is important and why it matters. And a lot of times the thesis and stakes are connected to one another. And this is important because it's not always easy to identify. Some authors make it explicit, and others you kind of have to search for and figure out yourself. So keep that in mind. The methods are, what are the methods that the author is using to support their arguments? So, are they doing an analysis of a film? Are they critiquing art? Are they creating a film? Are they creating poetry? Is it autobiography, right? A lot of the work that we read is methods ranging from anthropology, queer studies, like media studies. There's very different methods that we will see throughout all of these essays. And when you're writing your one paragraph summary of the readings, some of you just saying are stating the reading and then stating in this reading the author's main this thesis is that on the second reading the author's. So I want you to move away from that and work on talking about the readings simultaneously. So you can, I say in this week's readings, a major theme was the theory of intersectionality, and it was discussed in Bell Hooks this way. It was mentioned by Dean Spade this way. So these are examples that you can use to sort of write out your response. You'll see, all of these skills are interconnected and will help you not only improve your writing skills but also your reading skills. The evidence would be the data that is being collected, and how is this data being analyzed is the second part of it. So if we're looking at this week's readings, for example, theory and the flesh, you could argue that the evidence is like embodied experiences. Shuri Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, Barbara Christian in her essay Theory and The Race for Theory. A lot of these authors that we're engaging with at these early stages of this discipline being formed are all speaking from a place of personal experience. And this is a reoccurring pattern in not only this type of scholarship, but many of the other um, authors and theories that we're going to engage with this semester. And then finally is the conclusion and the new research opportunities that are becoming available. A lot of times when you're reading an essay or an argument, you'll see that at the end, the author summarizes their main arguments and why it was important, their stakes, their methods, and then they provide a sentence or two of where this research could go for the future, how other scholars might be able to build on this work. And this is why I ask you to propose a question at the end of your response. And it's very important because I am answering your questions as much as I can, unless I say it's like a difficult response or it's something like we need more follow up. But for the most part, I am answering your questions on your responses. And I want you to always keep that in mind as a practice to build on. Like, how are you responding? And then also leaving your response for conversation for other people to respond to. Remember that you don't always have to write your own original response. You can also respond to a student's, as long as you're also answering the questions and providing all of the information in the modules tab that I'm asking you to identify. So for this week, this is what I want you to look at. There's 2 extra credit opportunities available this week. The first one is this exhibit by an artist named Hannah Black. And her work is not only brilliant, but this specific exhibit here, which was in New York a few years ago, really speaks at this week's concept of flesh that we're working through and thinking about. So for your extra credit, I want you to just read this article, review the images, and give me feedback on what was your response, how does it relate to the week's materials and the readings, and how did you feel, what did you think about the art? And if you need any tips on how to write about art, feel free to email me so I can provide some links or additional support on how to write about art and how to guide that. But that's one extra credit opportunity. And then the second extra credit opportunity is actually so for the readings This week you have Sherry Moragas, Four Myths by Alan Paez, Maria Lugones, and this fourth reading, How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa, is an extra credit reading. So for this as well, you can read the reading, write one page double spaced response. That's just one page, not front and back, just one page. Feel free to write more, but that's the minimum. And you can do both of these extra credit options. It doesn't have to be one or the other. You could do the Hannah Black and this reading. And just so you have an understanding, the extra credit is actually going to take place of like a missing assignment or an assignment where you didn't receive enough points. And you have that option to do that, or you have the option to have all of them be collected to be added as final points to your grade at the end of the semester. So if you have like an 85 and you've done 5 extra credit assignments, be able to use 5 extra credit points on your uh, end of term grade. So if you have an 85, you have a 90, something like that. But keep in mind that not all of them will be available each week. So for now, I wanted to start off with 2 great readings and exhibits that I think you will really enjoy and really relate to this week. This week is pretty less intensive than the weeks before because we were really building like a foundation for how this class is going to work, what the readings are going to be about, and the type of work you're going to be reading. Next week, we're going to focus entirely on one essay alone, and don't underestimate this essay. Just because it's only one essay does not mean that it's going to be an easy week. I've specifically done that because it's an intense essay that argues about different that whose arguments are related to so many different components of this class. And we're going to learn about Horton Spillers. So we'll talk a lot more about that next week. But for now, I want you to focus on these readings, and we're going to jump right into the lecture for this week. But I did talk about this tool that I want you to constantly use, refer back to when you're writing your responses, doing your readings. It's very helpful. Now let's turn to the lecture. So okay. So this week last week you read Barbara Christian's essay on the race for theory, and a lot of you did such an excellent job analyzing this essay. I can tell that it was engaging for a lot of you. It's actually one of my favorite pieces ever, and the reason I assign it is because it continues to be so accurate of what academia is like and is always has been like for so long and continues to be. So one of the key things is that we're engaging with this notion of theory, and today's week is theory in the flesh. And when we talk about theorizing, and Barbara Christian does a great job at telling us exactly what the race for theory is and how it functions. And she says that oftentimes theory is defined solely in terms of a European Western canon, and that it's particularly created by a type of body that is white and masculine. So, what we're learning about is that for a lot of feminist scholars, theory is something that is embodied and that is practiced every day, that it's not something that is abstract and objective and separate from the creator of the theory, but it's actually something that's very intimate and embodied and practiced and essential. And you'll read in Shuri Moraga's that for her, theory is not just something that is produced or written about or published, but it's something that is specifically in the flesh. And this is why we start with her, and then we go into this more really deep conversation about what's this legacy of flesh and what's this history of flesh that we're discussing. Um, so in the Race for Theory, Barbara Christian asks, what is theory? Who engages in theory and who controls theory? And she says Western philosophers often that they have changed literary critical language to suit their own purposes as philosophers, and that they have reinvented the meaning of theory. So this is something that you can really see for yourself when you think about it. Like if you think about common depictions or portrayals of someone who is a genius or a professor or a philosopher, oftentimes we see very white, hegemonic depictions of men. And what I mean by hegemonic is very, very similar, right? It becomes a mainstream dominant form that is used to portray what who is considered a philosopher and who is considered a theorist. But one of the key things that I want you to get out of this course is that theory is something we all do every single day at all times, and that it is extremely political. So when we engage in making sense of our surroundings, who we are, how we identify in relation to others, that's all theorizing. Many of the readings that we engage with, such as Audre Lorde's work in Sister Outsider, Gloria Anzaldua's work in Borderlands, this work from Shuri Moraga comes from this canon of a text called This Bridge Called My Back, and was published around the 80s. And like I said, we're still engaging with this wave of feminism, or as some would call wave of feminism from the 80s, 90s, as like a historical um, period that we can reflect on now and look back on now as by looking at the scholarship that was being produced and how these scholars were in conversation with each other. And you'll see that a lot of this work continues to carry on today and also builds a lot of the language that a lot of activists, organizers, social media activism use now. Um, Part of Christian's argument is that theory is a commodity. And what she means by a commodity is that it's become something that has not just monetary value, but also social capital, right? The more theory you produce, the more of an established scholar you are. So that's why she says it's this constant race for theory. But she also asks very critical questions that we'll be asking throughout the semester, which are who controls theory production and what is the language that they use? Well, how do they control language and who gets access to this? Um, so please keep all of that in mind. On page 68, there's a great quote here that I wanted you to sort of look at and sit with. Um, and it's basically what I've been arguing throughout this lecture is that Christian states, for people of color have always theorized, but in forms quite different from the Western form of abstract logic. And I am inclined to say that our theorizing, and I intentionally use the verb rather than the noun, is often in narrative forms, in the stories we create, in riddles, in proverbs, in the play with the language, because dynamic rather than fixed ideas seem more to our liking. So a lot of times I'm going to include quotes here that you don't necessarily have to discuss in your responses, but will help you guide your responses in terms of getting at the critical parts of the thesis statement, the methods, the stakes of the work. Um, So she says that the race war theory consists of linguistic jargon, that it is full of language that is difficult to read, to interpret, to analyze. And this is interesting because I think um, there are a lot of times scholars who purposely use language that is not accessible to people. But that does not mean that there can't be room for scholars to learn to use that language themselves. So there's different ways of understanding the type of language that academics use, and I think in your own practice with the engaging with this material, you'll develop your own like your own way of figuring out what language is useful for you and what language is not. And I want you to always learn how to translate and interpret other languages that you might not be used to. So even if you are not used to reading very academic heavy language, that's okay, because part of what this class is about is learning how to interpret that language to make it sense in your own meaning, in your own terms. And that's what's important about it. Not so much whether you understand every single little thing that is being said, but that you get to identify like what are the key points and how does it relate to you, to your beliefs, to your own ideas and practices. So that's just something to note, that a lot of these readings, I don't expect you to have 100% understanding of them. It's just each one is a tool to get you to understand bigger concepts. And my job is to show you what those concepts are. Um, so the race for theory also emphasizes for a Christian, she identifies it as always having biblical exegesis in a white supremacist manner. This doesn't mean that speaking and referring to religious or even any type of religious biblical um, language is wrong. But for her, she's saying in this white supremacist way of using that language to isolate certain communities. Um, and it often, this race for theory doesn't acknowledge creative work. So artistic practices, all of that is sort of seen as not academic, not valid, emotional. So you see this immediate binary come into play where that kind of work is seen as not valid, and the work written by Western European thinkers is considered objective, valid, scientific. It has not only validity in society, but it also has social capital, right? And we see this all the time, and how certain careers become considered more valid than others. For example, like doctors and lawyers, in comparison to nurses or teachers or caretakers or anything that's considered feminine work. And we'll talk more about that in the following weeks when we get into our labor and family section. Um, so she's constantly identifying all of this work, and she says that it's important to identify how you feel when you write, and to note that the writer is always writing in a collective manner, that it is always a collective project. So, a lot of times when we are talking about the history of feminist movements or the history of disciplines like Latino studies and departments in college universities, or Chicano studies or Mexican American studies, all of that was born in the 1960s and 1970s, and were primarily led by Black arts movements that contributed to the emergence of Black studies, feminist literary critique, women's studies. This is around the time when all of these disciplines start to arise. So you see that this discipline is unique in certain ways because it's new compared to a field like history or English. A lot of times, those fields have long established histories and departments. So it's something to note, and to note because it impacts the type of work that is produced. Um, a lot of you also did a great job referring to Bell Hook's work. I really, really, really appreciated how some of you created a great juxtaposition between the two authors and the type of work that they are arguing about. Um, there's a lot of uh, aspects to this class that are really that really emphasize this understanding between theory and practice, and what these two things look like when they are together. So a lot of times different fields or disciplines refer to this phenomenon or this action as praxis with an XIS, to refer to both the act of theorizing and putting those theories into work, putting it into practice, which is identified as praxis. And Bell Hooks is great at discussing this, right? And she does it in her writing. She talks about it in her lived experiences growing up as a child, and how she was constantly theorizing even as a young kid. She states on page 68, "For it is indeed the purpose of such theory to divide, separate, exclude, keep at a distance. And because this theory continues to be used to silence, censor, and devalue various feminist theoretical voices, we cannot simply ignore it." So she says that white hegemonic theory is used as an instrument of domination, and that if used differently and creatively, it has the potential to heal. But it's important to recognize that there is no distinction really between theory and practice, because they are constantly happening together, working together simultaneously all the time. So when you are thinking about the material for this week, for in terms of Shari Moraga's work and her essay of Theory in the Flesh, you really want to get at, what does she mean by theory as personal testimony, theory as lived experience? Um, Think about this in your own lives. How do you constantly theorize about your surroundings, where you are, where you live? Do you think about those things? Maybe you don't. Maybe you want to start thinking about them, or maybe you prefer not to. All of that is okay. I want you to just think about that as you're writing out your response. And then the other quick media graphic that I wanted to show you, and whose work we have reviewed a lot, is a scholar by the name Alok, whose videos and poetry and readings we've engaged with a little bit so far in the semester. But they have these amazing reports on their social media on Instagram available, and they're actually available, accessible really quick. You can just click on this section here. It says book reports, and they have all these different ones that I want us to look at throughout the semester. But we're going to be focusing today on this one called White Feminism, A Brief History. So please feel free to check these out. I'm going to try to integrate as many of these as I can this semester. But I want us to go through it real brief. And if you are interested in getting a physical copy of this, I believe that it's available on their website. Yeah. And you can actually, I think you'll be able to purchase it. But if you don't have access to it, you can definitely check it out on here. So it's called White Feminism, A Brief History, a book report by Alok. So it states, racism was foundational to the feminist movement in the US prior to Civil War. As we discussed in our class, and in this book report, it states suffragists like Katie Stanton argue that white women and Black men shared a similar struggle. Black men were made property by slavery and white women by marriage. White women made claims to the victimization of slavery, refusing to acknowledge the racial power they shared with white men, and ignoring how white women also held Black people captive. That's the key critical part of Sojourner Truth's essay here, and a lot of the early readings that we engaged with in the first and second week of the semester. After the emancipation of slavery, the women's movement remained largely racially segregated. White women dismissed the concerns of Black women as quote unquote race questions. And we see this is very prevalent in the work that we're reading with right now, in terms of Barbara Christian's essay, Bell Hook's work, um, and will continue to sit with this history of the white feminist movement as we continue with the semester. Um, White women dismissed the concerns of Black women as quote unquote the race questions. In 1884, renowned suffragist Susan B. Anthony remarked, quote, I have but one question, that of equality between the sexes. That of the races has no place on our platform. So made it very clear here that their efforts and their work towards liberation specifically was about white women, as we learned in the early weeks of our class. During this period, the dominant scientific idea was that sex and gender were race specific. Make sure you keep a note on that. Sex and gender were race specific. And what that means is that how one person could get access to the category of sex and the category of gender. For example, how someone could be considered female or male or be considered a man or a woman determined heavily on their race. As William I. Thomas argued in 1897, quote, the less civilized the race, the less is the physical differences of the sexes, end quote. Eugenicists believed that sex differences between males and females were the product of racial progress. This means they confined women to the domestic sphere because it was seen as civilizational and an accomplishment of racial superiority that was defined against the quote unquote savage, quote unquote matriarchy of indigenous people. So this is the key part that I want you to note here. Eugenicists, which are a type of race science that was used to scientifically provide evidence of white racial superiority. They believed, these scientists in this time period in the 1890s, believed that sex differences between men and women, males and females, not men and women, I'm sorry, that males and females was the product of racial advancement. In other words, differences between men and women were because of their racial superiority and because they were considered um, superior to other races. And because of that superiority, they had access to be able to perform being male and being female as best as possible and as perfect as possible, because indigenous Black people were seen as savage and unable to perform gender and to perform sex in this way. Um, and if you have questions about this, I want you to please definitely reach out, because this is a critical component to this understanding between when you're talking about gender in your responses, that you're actually referring to gender and not sex, and what these two different categories mean, as we've learned in the class. Political rights for white women challenged the hierarchy of sexual difference on which white supremacy was based. White men feared that if women got the right to vote, society would devolve back to primitivism. They justified denying women rights by claiming that they were biologically meant for reproduction, not political thought. In response, feminists like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose work we read a little bit, argued that white women's biological difference was actually evidence that they shared in the racial superiority of the white race, as opposed to sexually ambiguous lower races. So this is specifically stating that white feminists at the time, feminist scholars like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, believed that white women, their differences in biology, what was evidence, was proof that they were superior to um, uh, Black and Indigenous communities whose biological differences always made created their gender to be ambiguous. So identifying gender ambiguity as something that you can't mark, you can't categorize. That is specific. That action is specific to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color communities. White feminists rewrote sexual difference as a proof of white supremacy. Leveraging racism to overcome sexism, white feminists argued that they deserved rights because they had an essential role as mothers of the race and messengers of civilization to the savage races of the world. Ironically, at the same time, white women critiqued sexist gender relations in their own communities. They argued that patriarchy was, quote, necessary for the advancement of primitive women. Black, Indigenous, and other racialized women were not seen as ready for feminism because they had to first demonstrate that they were true women, pious, submissive, well dressed. They become the yardstick by which white women measured their own moral status and social progress. So, these reports are just excellent at really getting at these key components of the course and what I really want you to get out of this class. So if you find these useful, please feel free to revisit them. Feel free to integrate them into your responses. And like I said, if you would like to have more of these, you can definitely check out their work here to see more of the book reports. And we'll be engaging with more throughout the semester. So for this week, I really just want you to focus on getting at this notion of theory and the flesh. What does Shuri Moraga mean by that? Your response can include all of the work that I talked about, and it could also refer to some of the past readings. I just want you to really focus mostly on minimizing your summary and providing more critical analysis of your own. That's all that I have. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And I look forward to reading all of your work this upcoming response.